All right, ready to dive into something really interesting today. We're going to take a deep dive into, well, excerpts from Sex and Character.
Okay.
It's a book from 1903 by Otto Weininger. And it caused quite a stir back then.
Yeah, Sex and Character, it's one of those books that didn't just spark controversy. It really captivated the scientific community in a way that few books do, you know?
Right.
You have a work here that really challenged how people viewed women and their place in society. But it was still deemed worthy of serious consideration, which I think really tells you something about that intellectual climate back then.
It really does. Now, I know we're talking about a book from 1903.
Right.
Which might seem like ancient history to some.
Sure.
But Weininger's ideas, they have this way of like still resonating, even today. Even if it's just to like ignite debate, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so interesting about him is that he wasn't just theorizing about this from, some ivory tower.
Right.
He was trying to blend deep introspection, really looking inward with actual scientific observation. It was almost like an artist dissecting the human form,
It's a really unique approach for sure.
Yeah.
So where does he even begin to try to like unravel this complexity?
Well, he introduces this concept of, and I know this is going to sound simple at first, male and female principles.
Okay.
But not in the way that you might initially think.
Okay.
He argued that these principles, which he called arenoplasm and the Heyerly-plasm, big words, I know,
Right.
were actually present within every single person.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he's talking about a spectrum here, not just a binary.
So not just male or female, but like a blend of both within each of us.
Precisely. And get this, he even suggested that these principles were active within every single cell of a person's body.
Wow.
So imagine it, right? This internal dance between masculine and feminine energies playing out at the most fundamental level.
That's a pretty wild concept. It's like having this internal tug of war going on inside of us.
Exactly. And this whole idea, it forms like the bedrock for a lot of his later arguments.
Okay.
Particularly when he gets into the nature of genius, which was a subject that he was like completely fascinated by.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting because he didn't just equate genius with talent. He saw it as something much, much deeper than that.
You're absolutely right. He's not talking about someone who's just merely skilled, right? He's talking about someone who embodies a universal quality. They possess this depth of memory that's almost boundless, connected to something timeless,
Like Mozart.
Exactly.
Da Vinci.
Exactly. Those figures whose work really transcends generations.
Okay, so what did he see as the hallmarks of a true genius?
So he points to this uncanny ability to remember even the smallest details with incredible clarity and to find connections between ideas that seem totally unrelated. To him, this was evidence of a deeper connection to like a universal consciousness.
It's like their minds are wired differently, allowing them to like tap into something much larger than themselves.
That's the idea. And this is unfortunately where Weininger's arguments take a bit of a controversial turn.
Here we go.
Yeah, particularly from our modern perspective. He believed that women lacked the capacity for this true genius.
And this is where, like, the historical context becomes really, really important.
Absolutely. You have to remember, this is the early 20th century.
Right.
Views on gender were dramatically different back then.
Yeah, women were, often kind of relegated to these specific societal roles and expectations during that time.
Precisely. And Weininger's observations on women's relationships with things like logic and morality and even individuality, they were very much a product of those times. For example, he interpreted what he perceived as a lack of interest in logic and abstract thought among women as evidence of what he called unconceptual minds.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas were just so intertwined with like the scientific and cultural beliefs of that era. But I got to ask.
Yeah.
Did he give any other explanations for these views or any examples to kind of illustrate these points?
He did, and this is where his work gets particularly complex, I think.
Okay.
And even more controversial, I think, to our modern ears.
Sure.
For instance, he delved into this concept of memory.
Okay.
Which he thought was like a really fundamental aspect of consciousness.
Okay.
And a key difference between men and women.
Okay.
Weininger thought that women's memories were much more sensory-based.
Okay.
Tied to their immediate experiences. While men were capable of more abstract conceptual memory.
So he's basically saying that women can only remember like things that have happened to them, but men can remember ideas.
Well, I think it's more nuanced than that, but in essence, yes. He saw this as further evidence of their what he perceived as a lack of intellectual capacity.
So this difference in memory, according to Weininger, was directly tied to his ideas about male and female principles.
Yes,
So
exactly.
he was trying to build this whole like framework around these concepts.
Precisely. And this framework led him to some provocative conclusions about womanhood itself.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, he introduced this, it's become kind of infamous, this dichotomy of women, the mother and the prostitute.
Okay, and this is the part that always raises eyebrows, but
Right.
I'm ready for it.
Right.
So break it down. What did he actually mean by using these terms?
So it's crucial to remember that he wasn't using these labels literally. He was talking about these as archetypes.
Right.
Psychological and biological ideals that he believed kind of represented the fundamental nature of women.
Okay, so more like two ends of a spectrum of womanhood.
Exactly. He believed that women were kind of inherently driven by these two forces, shaping their interactions with men, children, society as a whole.
So the mother archetype, in his view, was a woman who was like completely devoted to like raising children and nurturing and like continuing life.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
Okay, and the prostitute, I'm guessing, is like the opposite end of that spectrum then.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
For Weininger, this archetype embodied a woman who was driven primarily by her sexuality, existing, and these are his words, for the pleasure of men and lacking a real connection to motherhood or any sense of a future beyond immediate gratification.
It's a very stark contrast,
Yes.
to say the least.
Yes, it is.
And honestly, even considering, when this was written, reducing all women to these two extremes just seems incredibly reductive, if not offensive.
You're absolutely right to feel that way, and it's very important to remember that we're not here to endorse these views in any way.
Oh.
We're here to unpack them, to try to understand them within their historical context and understand their impact, I think.
Yeah.
This binary view of women is precisely what makes Weininger's work so fascinating, but also so troubling at the same time.
Right.
It forces us to confront how these societal norms and these expectations really shape our understanding of gender, even if those understandings are flawed.
It's a good reminder that these weren't just like abstract theories for him.
Right.
They were directly tied to his worldview and how he saw society as a whole.
Precisely. And this is where I think Weininger's arguments take another sharp turn.
Okay.
He was totally against the women's emancipation movement.
Really?
He thought that it completely misunderstood the true nature of what he saw as women's inherent bondage, I think was the word he used, this inextricable connection to sexuality.
So he's basically saying that women are limited by their sexuality.
In essence, yes, that was his view.
Which seems like a very contradictory stance to take, especially when he's claiming to advocate for their liberation.
It does, doesn't it? And his solution to this was if anything even more radical.
Okay.
Instead of saying, women should have equal rights within, society's existing framework, he envisioned a future where people could transcend the limitations of sex altogether.
So like a genderless utopia.
In a way, yes.
Wow, that's a pretty wild concept, especially for the early 1900s.
It certainly is, but it speaks to the unconventional and oftentimes contradictory nature of Weininger's thinking.
Right, he was very much a product of his time, but also grappling with these ideas that were very progressive, but also pretty regressive at the same time.
Absolutely, insightful and deeply flawed all at once.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that exploring these historical texts isn't about condoning these views.
Right.
It's about understanding how they shaped the intellectual landscape and how they continue to spark debate, even to this day. It really makes you think, here we are over a century later still talking about these ideas that were like radical even back then. It makes you wonder how much of how we see gender and genius today is still kind of like wrestling with these old debates.
I think that's the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Right.
Weininger's work, I think, it really reminds us that these ideas, even the ones that seem outlandish, can have a real lasting impact. And they spark these dialogues that carry on for generations.
And while it's tempting to just dismiss Weininger's views as,
Yeah.
oh, that was a different time,
Right.
I think there's value in looking at how these concepts, even the flawed ones, contributed to how we understand gender and identity, even, human potential today.
Absolutely. Take his concept of androgyny, for example. I mean, the way he framed it was definitely rooted in the limitations of his time, for sure.
Right.
But it speaks to this kind of timeless fascination with the idea of going beyond these traditional gender roles,
Yeah.
embracing a more fluid, multifaceted understanding of who we are.
It's like he kind of stumbled onto this concept that foreshadowed, in a way, this future where gender isn't, this rigid binary,
Right.
but it's more of a
Choose
spectrum.
from of possibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, like, how much progress have we actually made since then?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, we've come a long way in terms of recognizing, the
Right.
accomplishments of women in all these different areas.
Of course, yeah.
And our definition of genius has expanded so much since then.
Mm-hmm.
But are there still these echoes of his ideas in our culture today?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's something for all of us to think about as we move through the world.
Yep.
How is our understanding of gender identity, the very nature of genius, how is that evolving? Are there these subtle biases, these hidden assumptions that we've kind of inherited from past generations, and how can we challenge those remnants of the past
Right.
to create a world that truly embraces, the full spectrum of human potential?
Those are really, really important questions to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the world of Otto Weininger and sex and character. It's a fascinating
It is.
and oftentimes unsettling book, but
Yeah.
but I think it really does give us a lot to think about and discuss.
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, so we hope this has kind of sparked your curiosity and
Yeah.
maybe given you a new way to look at these big questions about who we are, what we're capable of, and how we understand the world around us. So
Yeah.
until next time, keep those minds engaged, keep those perspectives open, and keep those conversations going.